Imagine this: someone says something cruel to you. Maybe it's a coworker making a sly comment in front of others. Maybe it's a family member bringing up a wound you thought had healed. Or maybe it's a stranger online typing words sharp enough to cut. At first, you tell yourself it's nothing. But then the heat rises. Your chest tightens. Your jaw locks. The words replay in your mind over and over as if your mind refuses to let them go. They walk away. Scene is over. But inside you, a fire has been lit. And long after they've forgotten, you're still burning. We often think of anger as something that happens to us, as if someone else has lit the match. But here's the truth most of us miss. We're the ones holding the match. We're the ones adding the wood, fanning the flames, making the fire grow hotter and hotter inside our own chest. And while we think this fire will leap out and scorch the other person, it burns us first. Always. The Buddha once compared anger to holding a burning coal, ready to throw it at someone who hurt you. But before the coal ever leaves your hand, before it ever reaches them, it has already burned your skin. That burn is not just metaphorical. Modern science agrees. When we feel anger, stress hormones flood our body. Our heart beats faster, blood pressure rises, the immune system weakens. The body pays a price for every moment we cling to rage, but the damage doesn't stop there. Anger blinds the mind. It warps our judgment. It whispers lies: you're right, they're wrong. You must defend yourself no matter the cost. And in that haze, we say things we can't take back. We make choices that echo far beyond the heat of the moment. I've seen this fire consume people. A father who didn't speak to his son for years, all because of one heated argument neither could remember clearly. A business partner who threw away decades of trust in a single night of fury. A mother whose sharp words still echo in her daughter's mind decades later. The fire doesn't just burn the one who holds it, it spreads, taking everything in its path. Relationships, opportunities, even the peace we thought was ours by right. But here's the most dangerous thing about this fire. We don't always notice it. It's easy to spot when someone is yelling, slamming doors, breaking things. But more often, anger hides. It simmers quietly under the surface, masked as cold silence, as cynicism, as a low hum of resentment we carry for years. We tell ourselves we're over it. We've moved on. But the truth, we've just gotten used to the heat. We're carrying a slow, steady burn we've forgotten how to put out. The question is, if this fire is so destructive, why do we hold on to it? Why not just let it go? Because in the moment, anger feels powerful. It feels righteous. It gives us the illusion that we're in control, that we're standing up for ourselves. But it's a false power, the kind of power that collapses the moment we see clearly. And that's the paradox. The very thing we believe is protecting us is what's destroying us from the inside. You don't have to be a monk to understand this. You've felt it before: the exhaustion after a fight, the regret after words you wish you could take back, the emptiness that comes when the adrenaline fades. We all know, deep down, that anger costs more than it gives. Yet in that moment, letting go feels impossible. It feels like surrender. It feels like weakness. But what if it isn't? What if letting go is not weakness, but the greatest strength you could ever develop? The path to that strength doesn't begin with blaming others for lighting the fire. It begins with seeing the fire clearly within ourselves. It begins with understanding how it starts, why we feed it, and how to let it burn out without consuming us. There is an old saying in Zen: when the fire goes out, the mind becomes a still lake, and in that stillness, we finally see the truth. In the moments ahead, we're going to step closer to this fire, not to get burned, but to understand it, to see its nature, to learn how to stop carrying burning coals in our own hands. And as we walk this path together, you might just discover something unexpected, that the power you thought came from anger was always waiting for you on the other side of letting go. When we hear the word poison, we think of something deadly, something you would never willingly swallow. And yet every day, without realizing it, many of us drink a slow, invisible poison. Its taste is familiar. Its effect is intoxicating. It lives inside the emotion we call anger. Buddhism names it sand, one of the three poisons that keep the wheel of suffering turning. The other two are tham, craving, and si, ignorance. Together, they feed each other, trap us in endless cycles of reaction, and keep us from seeing life clearly. Anger is the most explosive of the three. It can erupt like lightning, sudden, blinding, impossible to ignore. But unlike lightning, it doesn't strike and vanish, it lingers. It sits in the mind, replaying insults, imagining revenge, building stories of me versus them. From the Buddhist view, anger isn't just an emotion. It's a lens, a distorted filter over the mind that colors everything we see. When we look through it, the world becomes hostile. Every word feels sharper. Every action feels personal. Every stranger becomes a potential enemy. And the tragedy is, we believe the lens is telling us the truth. We mistake the storm in our mind for the weather outside. Science confirms what the Buddha taught 500 years ago. The moment anger flares, our body changes. The brain's amygdala, the alarm system, fires off signals of danger. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream. The heart pumps harder, blood pressure spikes, muscles tighten. The body is ready for battle, even when there's no real enemy in front of us. The longer we hold on to that anger, the more damage it does, corroding blood vessels, weakening the immune system, and etching patterns of reactivity deep into the brain. Neuroscientists have found that repeated anger actually reshapes neural pathways, making us more likely to get angry in the future. In other words, the more we drink the poison, the more our body craves it. But anger's most dangerous effect is not on the body, it's on the heart. Not the physical heart, but the heart-mind, the place where wisdom and compassion live. Anger builds a wall around it. A wall that says, I must protect myself at all costs. But that wall doesn't just keep danger out. It also keeps love, connection, and understanding from getting in. And here lies the subtle cruelty of anger. It convinces us we are defending ourselves, while it is quietly destroying the very peace we're trying to protect. There is a story from the Buddhist texts about a monk named Pindola. One day, while he was meditating under a tree, a group of men walked by. They mocked him, hurled insults, even threw dirt at his robes. Yet Pindola sat unmoved, his face calm. When they finally asked him why he didn't react, he said, "If a gift is offered and not accepted, to whom does it belong?" They answered, "To the one who offered it." Then Pindola smiled, "So it is with your anger. I have not accepted it. It remains with you." This is what it means to see anger as a poison, not just for the one who holds it, but for the one who tries to give it away. If you don't drink it, it cannot harm you. But if you take it into your mind, even for a moment, it begins its work, burning, clouding, corroding from within. The Buddha taught that the antidote to anger is not more anger, not retaliation, not cold silence, not mental arguments we replay endlessly in our head. The antidote is understanding. When you understand the nature of anger, it begins to lose its grip. But understanding is not just intellectual, it is experiential. You have to see the moment anger arises. You have to feel its heat in your body, hear the way it changes your inner voice, notice how it tries to pull you into its story. And in that moment of seeing clearly, you take the first step toward freedom, because anger cannot survive in the light of awareness. Like a shadow, it fades when you turn toward it. The journey doesn't end with noticing the poison. It begins there. Once you see it for what it is, you can learn how to stop feeding it, how to let it burn itself out until only clarity remains. And the first step to letting go is to understand why anger feels so powerful, yet leaves us weaker than before. There's a reason we cling to anger, even when we know it hurts us. In the moment, it feels like fire in our veins, hot, alive, unstoppable. It gives us a rush, a sense of certainty, as if we finally have the courage to say what we've been holding back, to take a stand, to fight back against the wrongs done to us. For a brief, intoxicating moment, anger feels like strength. Think about the last time you were truly angry. Your chest expanded. Your voice grew louder. Your thoughts sharpened into a single point, like the tip of an arrow aimed at your target. It feels good in a way, doesn't it? That surge of energy, that righteous conviction, I am right, they are wrong, they deserve this. But here's the catch, this strength is an illusion. Buddhism teaches that true strength is not the ability to overpower someone else. It is the ability to master yourself. And anger, no matter how powerful it feels, is a sign we have lost that mastery. When anger takes over, it's not you speaking anymore. It's your wounded ego. It's the ancient animal brain, wired for survival, hijacking the wheel and driving you straight into suffering. You may win the argument. You may silence the other person. But in doing so, you lose the one battle that truly matters, the battle within. There's a saying from the Dhammapada: though one may conquer 1,000 men in battle, the greatest victory is over oneself. I once heard the story of a general, feared across kingdoms for his skill in war. He could crush armies, seize cities, bend nations to his will. But one night, his closest friend made a careless remark at a banquet. The general's face turned red, his voice rose, and in front of everyone, he struck the man down in a rage. And in that instant, the mighty general, who could not be defeated by thousands, was defeated by a single sentence. That's the truth about anger. It doesn't make us stronger. It makes us easier to control. One insult, one misunderstanding, one careless action from another person, and suddenly we hand them the keys to our inner world. They don't have to lift a finger to ruin our peace. All they have to do is light the match, and we burn ourselves for them. Modern science offers another angle. That rush we feel in anger. It's adrenaline, dopamine, cortisol, a chemical cocktail that makes us feel powerful, but at the cost of our clarity. It narrows our focus so much that we can't see the bigger picture. It makes us reactive instead of responsive. And when the chemicals fade, what's left is not empowerment, but exhaustion, regret, and sometimes shame. But anger doesn't just rob us in the moment. It leaves marks. Sharp words spoken in a burst of heat can leave scars in relationships that never fully heal. A single angry decision can set off a chain of consequences that follow us for years. It's like swinging a sword in the dark. Yes, you might hit your target, but you might also cut down everything you were trying to protect. Here's the paradox. The more we believe anger gives us power, the more powerless we actually become. We start to define ourselves by our reactions instead of our choices. We start to let the world pull our strings, like a puppet dancing to the tune of every irritation, every offense. True strength doesn't come from the fire of anger. It comes from the stillness that can hold the fire without being consumed by it. The Buddha once asked his students, if someone strikes you with a stick, do you become angry at the stick or the person holding it? They replied, the person, of course. And if that person was driven by ignorance and their own suffering, should you not be angry at the ignorance rather than the person? In that teaching lies the seed of real power, seeing beyond the surface, refusing to be blinded by the rush of the moment, choosing compassion over reaction. When you start to understand this, anger loses its glamour. It stops feeling like strength and starts revealing itself for what it is, a thief, robbing you of your peace, your clarity, and your freedom. And once you see the thief clearly, you no longer invite it into your home. But knowing this isn't enough. We need to see anger for what it truly is, not in theory, but in the raw, unfiltered reality of our own lives. And one of the clearest ways to see it is through a story the Buddha told, a simple image that captures the entire truth of anger in just a few words. There is a moment in the Buddha's teaching when he captures the entire nature of anger in a single, unforgettable image. It begins with a question. Suppose, he says, you are holding a burning coal in your hand. Your fist is clenched around it, your arm drawn back, ready to throw it at the person who wronged you. You feel the heat, you feel the burn, but you do not let go. Because in your mind, this coal, this weapon, is going to hurt them to make them feel what you feel. And yet, before it ever leaves your hand, before it even touches the one you aim it at, it has already burned you. This is anger, a self-inflicted wound we believe will wound another, a pain we nurture in the hope it will leap across the gap between us and scorch someone else. But here's the truth. Sometimes the coal never leaves our hand at all. We carry it for hours, days, even years. And the longer we hold it, the deeper the burn. When I first heard this parable, I thought it was just a metaphor, but life has a way of proving such metaphors painfully real. I remember speaking with a man in his late 60s, a quiet grandfather with gentle eyes. He told me he had not spoken to his brother for 30 years. It started with an argument over money, a sum so small that by today's standards it was almost nothing. But he carried that hot coal for decades, through weddings and funerals, through the birth of children and the loss of parents. And one day he heard that his brother had died. The coal was still in his hand. But now there was no one left to throw it at. Only the scar remained. The Buddha's parable isn't about shaming us for feeling anger. It's about seeing the cost of holding on to it. Because when you clutch that coal, you aren't just burning your own skin. You're burning your peace, your health, your relationships, your future. The coal doesn't care if your anger is justified. It burns the innocent and the guilty alike. In our modern world, the coal takes many forms. It might be a text you type but never send, yet you reread it over and over in your drafts. It might be an insult you replay in your mind like a favorite song, fueling your indignation each time. It might be that silent grudge you wear like armor, believing it protects you, when in truth it just makes you heavier. And each time you rehearse that moment, each time you nurse that wound, you're pressing the coal deeper into your palm. Here's the part most people miss. Letting go of the coal is not for the other person's benefit, it's for yours. When you release it, you stop the burning. You stop feeding the fire that's consuming your energy, your focus, your joy. And in that release, you create space for clarity, for healing, for the life you actually want to live. A monk once said to his students, "You cannot throw fire without getting burned. The question is not whether you will be hurt. It is how quickly you are willing to stop hurting yourself." The parable of the hot coal is not asking you to be passive. It's asking you to be wise, to see that the truest form of victory is not striking back. It's refusing to be controlled by the heat in your own hand. When you understand this, the coal becomes easier to recognize. The next time anger rises, you might feel it, a sharp weight in the chest, a heat in the mind. And in that moment, you'll remember, this is the coal. I can drop it now. And when you do drop it, something remarkable happens. You realize that the hand you thought was made for throwing was always meant for holding, for building, for offering peace. The question is, if anger is a hot coal, what happens when we keep throwing it into the world? What ripples does it create, not just in our own lives, but in the lives around us? The answer lies in the way anger moves through the web of cause and effect. In the way it shapes the karma we carry forward. When a stone drops into a still pond, the ripples seem small at first, but they travel outward, touching every corner of the water. Anger works the same way. One thought, one word, one action born from its heat, and the waves it sends out can reach farther than we ever imagined. In Buddhism, this is karma, not a cosmic punishment, not fate written in the stars, but the simple truth of cause and effect. Every action, every word, every thought plants a seed, and like all seeds, it will grow. Sometimes quickly, sometimes years later, but it will grow. When we act from anger, the seeds we plant are sharp and bitter. We may throw them in a single moment of rage, but they take root in the minds and hearts of others. An insult can plant resentment in someone that blooms decades later. A careless act can trigger a chain of harm that keeps spreading, long after we've forgotten it. The Buddha compared it to lighting a torch from another torch. One flame becomes two, two become four, and soon the whole forest is on fire. I once met a woman who carried the weight of something she'd said 20 years earlier. She was young then, quick-tempered, and in an argument with her best friend, she spoke words meant to cut deep. They did. The friendship ended that night. Years later, she heard from someone else that her friend had never truly recovered from those words. It had changed the way she trusted people. It had shaped the way she saw herself. That one moment of heat had sent ripples she could never take back. But karma is not just about the effect on others, it's about what happens inside us. Each time we give in to anger, we deepen the habit of reacting with heat instead of clarity. We teach our mind that this is how we deal with discomfort. We fight it. We lash out, we burn. And the more we repeat it, the more automatic it becomes. Like a path worn into the grass, our thoughts start taking the same route every time. until one day we're no longer choosing anger, it's choosing us. This is why the Buddha called anger one of the great obstacles to liberation, because it doesn't just hurt others, it chains us to the cycle of cause and effect. Every moment of anger plants seeds for more anger in the future. It keeps us spinning on the wheel of samsara, unable to step off into freedom. But karma is not a prison, it's a teacher. The same law that spreads the ripples of harm also spreads the ripples of kindness. If one angry word can echo for years, so can one word of understanding. If one hurtful act can shape a life, so can one act of compassion. The difference lies in the seeds we choose to plant. In the stillness after anger, there is always a choice. Do we drop another stone into the water and keep the ripples going? Or do we let the surface grow calm again? Some people believe they can control the reach of their anger. I'll just vent a little, then it's done. But ripples don't work that way. Once they are in motion, they move beyond our control. Once the flame leaps from our torch, we can't decide how far it burns. This is why mindfulness matters. It's not just about calming down, it's about catching the moment before we plant the seed. It's about noticing the first ripple before it becomes a wave. Because here's the truth. Every act of anger is an inheritance we leave in the world. And one day, those ripples will return to us, sometimes in ways we recognize, sometimes in ways we don't. There is a Tibetan teaching that says, "Be mindful of the seeds you plant, for they will grow in the garden you must walk through tomorrow. If we plant thorns, we will walk among thorns. If we plant shade trees, we will walk in the cool." So the question becomes, how do we stop planting the seeds of anger and start planting the seeds of peace? The answer often lies not in philosophy, but in the living examples of those who have mastered patience and compassion, even in the face of deep offense. And that's where our journey turns next, to the stories of people who have met anger with something far stronger and far more transformative. In every age, there have been people who carried a strange kind of power, the power to meet anger not with fire but with water, to stand in the path of hate and choose not to return it, to face insult, injury, even cruelty, and still not be moved to strike back. Their strength wasn't in their fists, but in the stillness of their hearts. One story comes from the time of the Buddha himself. It's said that as he traveled, a man approached him in a marketplace and began shouting, accusing him of being a fraud, a hypocrite, a danger to society. The crowd grew silent, waiting for the Buddha to defend himself. But the Buddha stood quietly, listening. When the man finally stopped to catch his breath, the Buddha asked him a single question. If someone offers you a gift and you choose not to accept it, to whom does the gift belong? The man frowned. It would still belong to the one who tried to give it. Exactly, the Buddha said. And in the same way, your anger remains yours when I do not accept it. The man was stunned. The crowd murmured. And without another word, the Buddha walked on, leaving behind a silence more powerful than any argument. Centuries later, another teacher in China faced a similar moment. A young monk, full of arrogance, decided to test him. He insulted the master in front of the students, mocking his robes, his age, his voice. The master smiled and said, "You have taken great care to prepare this meal of words for me, but today I am not hungry." And that was it. The insult found no place to land. The monk, expecting a fight, found only an open sky. But these stories are not just relics of the past. They live today in people whose names the world may never know. A friend once told me about her father, a gentle man who ran a small store. One afternoon, a customer stormed in, furious about a misunderstanding with a product. He shouted, slammed his fist on the counter, and demanded a refund in front of everyone. Her father didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply listened, nodded, and said, "I see you're upset. Let me fix this for you." Within minutes, the anger dissolved. The man left not only with his refund, but with an embarrassed smile. And years later, he returned, not to buy anything, but to thank the shopkeeper for the kindness he'd shown that day. Patience and compassion do not mean weakness. They do not mean letting others walk over us. They mean choosing the ground on which we stand. When someone throws fire, we can choose not to stand in dry grass. We can choose to be the rain instead. It is not easy. It takes practice to keep the heart open when the mind wants to slam the door. It takes awareness to see that another's anger is often a mask for their pain. The truth is, most people who hurt us are themselves hurting. Most people who lash out are drowning in their own suffering. And when we answer with compassion, we don't just protect ourselves, we offer them a glimpse of another way. There's an old saying, anyone can throw a stone into a river and make waves, but only the wise can let the river flow undisturbed. Those who have mastered this art have a certain presence. When you meet them, you feel safe. You feel seen. Because they do not see you as an enemy to defeat, but as a fellow human being, sometimes lost, sometimes struggling just like themselves. And here lies the quiet truth. Compassion, once practiced, becomes contagious. It spreads in ways we may never witness. One act of patience can inspire another. One moment of understanding can soften someone's heart, who then softens another's, and so the ripples move, not of harm this time, but of healing. So perhaps the real question is not how do we avoid anger, but how do we replace it with something more powerful? The answer, as we'll see next, lies in the training of the mind. In learning to catch the flame at its smallest spark. There's a strange truth about the human mind. It loves to hold on, to grudges, to old wounds, to the words someone spoke in anger 10 years ago. We replay moments like scratched records over and over, even when the song has long since ended. And every replay, every remembering, breathes life into the pain again. It's as if we keep picking at a wound, shocked each time it bleeds. But here's where both ancient wisdom and modern science agree. Holding on doesn't protect us, it traps us. Neuroscientists have found that when we revisit an angry memory, the brain doesn't just recall it, it relives it. Stress hormones flood the body. The heart rate rises. Muscles tense. Your body behaves as if the original offense is happening again right now. It means that by holding on, we are effectively re-injuring ourselves, sometimes thousands of times, long after the actual moment is gone. Buddhism calls this second arrow suffering. The first arrow is the pain itself, the event, the insult, the loss. The second arrow is the pain we inflict on ourselves by holding on, by replaying, by refusing to release. The Buddhist teaching is radical in its simplicity. You cannot always avoid the first arrow, but you can refuse to fire the second. Letting go isn't about denying what happened. It isn't about pretending it didn't hurt. It's about choosing not to let the hurt own you. When you let go, you reclaim your inner space. You stop renting your mind to people and moments that no longer deserve to live there. Modern psychology backs this up. Studies on forgiveness and emotional release show that those who practice letting go have lower blood pressure, stronger immune systems, and better sleep. It's as if the body, once freed from carrying the weight, finally breathes again. And here's the fascinating part. Letting go is a skill. It can be trained. The mind is like a hand that has learned to clench into a fist. Letting go is the process of slowly teaching it to open again. Meditation is one of the most powerful tools for this, not because it erases memories, but because it changes our relationship to them. In meditation, a thought can arise. She betrayed me. They disrespected me. I can't believe they said that. And instead of gripping it tighter, you watch it float by like a leaf on a stream. You see it, you acknowledge it, and then you let it move on. There's also the practice of reframing, looking at the event through a different lens. Instead of "he hurt me," it becomes "he was hurting and he didn't know how else to act." Instead of "they took something from me," it becomes "they acted from their own fear and ignorance," something we all fall into. Reframing doesn't excuse the behavior, but it removes the poison from the wound. It lets you step out of the role of victim and into the role of witness. And here's a truth many resist. Sometimes letting go means we stop trying to get closure from the other person. We stop waiting for the apology that may never come. We stop needing the other side to admit they were wrong. We realize that freedom isn't something they can give us, it's something we give ourselves. It's like carrying a burning coal in your hand, hoping to throw it at the one who hurt you. But the longer you hold it, the more it's you who gets burned. Letting go is the moment you finally drop it, not because they deserve your mercy, but because you deserve your peace. The science of letting go is clear. Your brain changes when you release. Your body heals when you release. Your spirit expands when you release. But to live it, not just know it, requires practice. It requires moments where you notice, here is the spark. Here is the coal. I have a choice now. And that choice, made again and again, becomes the path to a life unshaken by every passing storm. When anger flares, it doesn't announce itself politely. It doesn't knock at your mind's door and ask if it may come in. It bursts through, loud, hot, insistent, like a storm breaking glass. And in that moment, reason often runs for cover. The mind fills with heat. The body stiffens. The breath shortens. We say things we later regret. We make decisions that leave ashes where trust used to be. Buddhism doesn't just warn us about this fire, it gives us tools to meet it. Not in theory, not in a monastery far from the chaos of life, but here in the living moment when the flame is already licking at our patience. Tool #1, the sacred pause. When the spark of anger hits, the first tool is not a complicated mantra. It's a pause, just one breath, one mindful inhale, one slow exhale. It sounds too simple, but here's what happens in that breath. Body shifts out of automatic reaction. The nervous system gets a chance to interrupt the surge of adrenaline, and your awareness steps in as the driver instead of anger holding the wheel. Even the Buddha taught, before speaking, before acting, breathe. Tool #2, name the fire. Psychologists call this affect labeling. Buddhism calls it mindfulness of mind. When you feel the heat rise, silently say, "This is anger. This is irritation. This is frustration." Naming it creates distance. It's no longer "I am angry." It becomes "anger is here." You shift from being the fire to simply noticing the fire, and that shift changes everything. Tool #3, cool it with compassion. This one sounds impossible until you practice it. The Buddha often said that anger is best cooled with compassion because compassion and anger cannot fully live in the same moment. The practice is this. When someone angers you, imagine their life beyond this moment. Imagine their struggles, their fears, their childhood, the invisible burdens they carry. You don't need to approve of their behavior. You simply see them as another human being, hurting in their own way, trapped in their own storms. This perspective softens the heart like a breeze across hot coals. Tool #4, walking meditation. When the mind is boiling, sometimes sitting still only makes the pressure worse. Walking meditation is movement with awareness. Each step is slow, deliberate, tied to the breath. Inhale, step. Exhale, step. The feet kiss the earth gently, as if each step is cooling the fire inside. The rhythm slows the heartbeat. The mind begins to settle. Tool #5, the 4 reflections. The Buddha encouraged contemplation on 4 truths when anger rises. Everything is impermanent. This moment, this argument, this insult, it will pass. I am responsible for my own mind. No one can force me to stay angry unless I let them. The other person is a mirror. Their actions reflect their state of mind, not my worth. Anger harms me first. Before it touches anyone else, it burns me. These reflections act like water poured onto the flame. Tool #6, release through the body. Sometimes the mind won't let go until the body does. The Buddha himself taught mindful movement, stretching, breathing deeply, even working with the body in daily chores to ground the mind. Tense your muscles as you inhale. Release them fully as you exhale. Let the tightness dissolve like mist in the morning sun. These tools are not magic spells. They won't make you immune to anger, but they will give you a choice in the heat of the moment, a choice to turn away from the flames before they consume you. And the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. Until one day you find yourself in the middle of a storm, and the fire that once would have raged simply doesn't ignite. Ahead, our journey draws us into a deeper truth. That mastering anger isn't just about protecting ourselves. It's about shaping the energy we send into the world, so that our presence itself becomes a cooling breeze in the heat of human conflict. There's a truth most people never discover. Anger isn't only a problem to be erased. It's also a messenger. We tend to treat anger like an intruder, slam the door, push it away, pretend it's not there. But in Buddhist practice, every emotion is a teacher, even the fire. Anger carries information. It tells us something feels unjust, something needs attention, something inside you is calling for change. But without wisdom, that message gets lost in the flames. We burn bridges instead of building them. We burn ourselves instead of learning. The transformation begins when we stop asking, "How do I get rid of this anger?" and start asking, "What is this anger trying to teach me?" Step 1. Listening without reacting. Imagine sitting with your anger as you would sit with a troubled friend. Not arguing, not feeding the drama, just listening. What happened? Why are you here? Maybe the anger points to a boundary crossed, a value ignored, a wound still bleeding. When you hear the message, you can act from clarity rather than impulse. That's the beginning of wisdom. Step 2. Separating the truth from the heat. Anger often contains a seed of truth, but it's buried in reaction, ego, and old pain. Wisdom is the skill of finding the seed and discarding the rest. The Buddha compared it to washing gold from the sand. You swirl it in the water, letting the dirt drift away, until the pure metal gleams in your hand. In the same way, you keep the insight and release the burning. Step 3. Turning the energy into compassionate action. Anger is raw energy. Left unchecked, it destroys. Channeled with wisdom, it can move mountains. Think of the reformers, the protectors, the healers, people who saw suffering, felt the fire, and transformed it into action that served others. Their power came not from suppressing anger, but from refining it. Instead of "I must punish," the mind shifts to "I must protect." Instead of "they are my enemy," the heart asks, "How can I prevent this harm for others?" The Buddhist lens, anger as a mirror. The Buddha taught that anger is never just about the other person, it's a reflection of what's inside us. When we see it clearly, we see the roots: fear, attachment, misunderstanding. Pull out the roots and the plant cannot grow again. In this way, each burst of anger becomes a chance to know ourselves more deeply, to free ourselves a little more. A story of transformation. There's a story in the Zen tradition about a monk who was constantly insulted by another. At first, the monk burned with resentment, but instead of reacting, he meditated on each insult as if it were a koan, a puzzle given by the universe. Months passed. The insults came, but the fire inside no longer lit. One day, the other man shouted the worst insult yet. The monk simply smiled. "What are you smiling at?" The man snapped. "I finally understand." The monk said, "You've been my teacher all along." When the fire becomes light, transforming anger into wisdom doesn't mean you never feel heat again. It means the heat becomes light. The same energy that once fueled destruction now illuminates understanding, strengthens compassion, and deepens your connection to others. When the fire is gone, the world feels different. Colors seem softer, yet somehow more alive. The air is lighter. And inside, where the flames once raged, there is now a lamp. Not a weak candle easily blown out, but a steady, warm light that neither blinds nor burns. This is what remains when anger no longer rules us. Clarity without harshness, strength without cruelty. You begin to see people not as enemies or allies, but as fellow travelers carrying their own hidden battles. Even those who once hurt you, you meet them with a heart that understands. You too were suffering, you too were burning. Life still brings storms. The world will still be unfair at times. But when you have learned to transform the fire into light, you are no longer at the mercy of every spark. You become the keeper of your own flame, and that light can guide others out of their own darkness. This is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of living differently, from a place where patience feels natural, where compassion is not a choice but a way of breathing. And maybe one day someone will ask you, "How do you stay so calm even when things go wrong?" And you'll smile, not with pride but with quiet gratitude, knowing the fire that once burned you has become the lamp that lights your path. If these words have touched something in you, let this be more than just a moment of listening. Carry it with you, and when you need a reminder, come back. Here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we share teachings, stories, and reflections to help you walk with more clarity, kindness, and peace. If this resonated with you, subscribe and join our growing circle of seekers. Together, we can keep the lamp lit, not just for ourselves, but for the world.